The story of Bridewell is a bit tricky. Its name sounds old, and it is. But the place people think of, the famous prison and workhouse, wasn't really a medieval thing. Its roots are medieval. The ground it stood on is ancient, but its life as a house of correction began after the Middle Ages were over. To understand what it became, you have to understand what it was first. And that story starts with a well. Long before any palace or prison, there was a spring. It was in London, just outside the old city walls. It was near the River Fleet, a small river that is now buried under the city's streets. This spring was called St. Bride's Well. St. Bride, or Bridget, was an Irish saint. Her name was attached to many holy wells across Britain. People believed the water had healing powers. They would come to drink it, to pray, to hope for a small miracle. A church was built nearby, St. Bride's Church. It's still there today, though. It's been rebuilt many times. So this little patch of London had a spiritual feeling to it. It was a place of faith and water. The area around the well and the church came to be known as Bridewell. It was just the place name, like any other neighborhood. For centuries, that's all it was. It wasn't a single building, it was a district. There were houses, there were businesses. The river fleet was busy with boats. Life went on. The land itself changed hands over the centuries. It was owned by powerful people, as most land in London was. At one point, a large building stood on the site. Some records call it a royal inn, a place for the king to stay when he was in this part of town. It wasn't a main palace, just a convenient lodging. It seems to have been used by several kings, but it was never a center of power. By the late 1400s, this building was old and falling apart. It was a place with a past, but not much of a future. Then came a new king, Henry VII, the first of the Tudors. He wasn't interested in the old building at Bridewell. He had other palaces, but his son, the future Henry VIII, would change everything. The medieval story of Bridewell is really the story of a location. It's about a well, a church, and a piece of land waiting for a new purpose. It was a quiet place on the edge of the bustling city. Its importance was local. The name existed, but it didn't mean anything special to people outside the area. It certainly didn't mean punishment or fear. Not yet. The ground held stories of healing and worship. The air was filled with the sounds of the river and the church bells. This was the medieval Bridewell. It was a physical place defined by its geography and its local church. It was not an institution. It was not a symbol of authority. It was just a corner of London with a very old name. Before the palace, before the prison, it was a place of quiet faith. This is important to remember, because the transformation of the site from a place of healing to a place of punishment is a story about how London and England itself was changing in a very big way. The Well of St. Bride would soon be overshadowed by a king's ambition, and later by a city's solution to a very human problem, poverty. The name Bridewell would one day be known across the world, but it started here, with a simple spring of water believed to be holy. Henry VIII was a man who liked to build. He wanted palaces that showed his power and wealth. He wanted modern, comfortable places for his court. The old royal lodging at Bridewell was a wreck, but the location was perfect. It was in London, but set slightly apart from the noise and smell of the walled city. It had a riverfront, which was great for travel and for impressive arrivals by barge. So, starting around 1515, Henry tore down the old structures and began building something new. He built Bridewell Palace. This was no small project. It was a massive brick palace built in the latest style. It was organized around two large courtyards. It had grand state apartments for the king and queen. It had long galleries, beautiful gardens, and a private connection to the river fleet. For about a decade, Bridewell was one of the most important royal residences in England. It was Henry's main home in London. Life in the palace was a world away from the old Bridewell of the Holy Well. It was a place of politics, power, and spectacle. Foreign ambassadors were entertained here. Lavish feasts were held. Important decisions were made in its council chambers. In 1522, a very important guest arrived, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. He was the most powerful man in Europe, and the nephew of Henry's wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon. His visit was a huge political event. Bridewell was decorated to impress him. Henry put on a show of wealth and strength, and Bridewell Palace was the stage. The palace wasn't just for show, it was a home. The royal family lived here. Their servants, hundreds of them, worked here. It was a self-contained community, a hub of activity. But Bridewell's time as a center of royal life was intense and short. Its most famous and most fateful moment came in 1529. This was the event that would seal its fate and send it on a different path. By this time, Henry was desperate for a son. His wife Catherine had given him only a daughter, Mary. Henry believed his marriage was cursed. He wanted a divorce or an annulment so he could marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope, however, was under the control of Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew. He would not grant the annulment, so a special court was set up in England to hear the case. This was called a legatine court, and it was held at Bridewell Palace. Imagine the scene. The great hall of the palace filled with bishops, nobles, and lawyers. King Henry sat on one side. Queen Catherine sat on the other. It was a public and humiliating trial. Catherine gave a famous, passionate speech. She knelt before Henry and pleaded her case, not as a queen, but as his wife of 20 years. She spoke of her loyalty and her love. She refused to accept the authority of the court and walked out. It was a moment of incredible drama. The court eventually failed to make a decision. Henry's frustration grew. This failure, which happened inside the walls of Bridewell, pushed Henry toward a drastic solution, breaking away from the authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church altogether. The English Reformation, one of the biggest events in the country's history, has a direct link to the events in that hall at Bridewell. After this, the palace lost its charm for Henry. It was filled with bad memories. He had been publicly thwarted there. His marriage had been publicly debated there. He soon acquired another property, York Place, which he renamed Whitehall. He began to spend more and more time there. Bridewell Palace, once the jewel of his London residences, was slowly abandoned. The king moved on. The court moved with him. The grand rooms fell silent. The gardens became overgrown. The once great palace began a slow slide into neglect. Its time as a royal home was over. It had been the setting for a king's ambition and a queen's heartbreak. Now it was just a large, empty building with a complicated past. And a palace without a king is just a collection of empty rooms. After Henry VIII moved to Whitehall, Bridewell Palace became a royal afterthought. It was no longer the center of the court. It was a place to store furniture, to house overflow guests, or to lend to visiting dignitaries for a short time. Its purpose was gone, and like any unused building, it began to decay. Roofs leaked. Your windows broke. The once magnificent brickwork started to crumble. The gardens were no longer tended with royal care. The palace was a ghost of its former self. While Bridewell was falling into disrepair, the city of London was facing a crisis. This was the mid-1500s. Henry VIII's religious changes had a huge social impact. His biggest move was the dissolution of the monasteries. For centuries, monasteries and convents had been a core part of the social safety net. They provided charity for the poor, care for the sick, and shelter for the homeless. When Henry shut them down and took their wealth, that entire system vanished almost overnight. Suddenly, thousands of people who relied on the church for help had nowhere to go. They flocked to the cities, especially London, looking for work or charity, but there wasn't enough of either. The city's streets filled with homeless people, unemployed men, orphaned children, and those too sick or old to work. The problem was huge and visible. The city authorities were overwhelmed. People at the time made a distinction between two types of poor people. There was the deserving poor. These were the elderly, the disabled, and young orphans who couldn't work. People felt they should be helped. Then there was the sturdy beggar or the idle poor. These were able-bodied people who didn't have a job. They were seen not as unfortunate, but as lazy and immoral. They were considered a threat to social order. The government passed harsh laws against vagrancy. People found begging could be whipped, branded, or even executed for repeat offenses. But punishment alone wasn't solving the problem. The streets were still full. A new idea began to take hold. Then, what if there was a way to deal with this problem differently? What if the idle poor could be put to work? What if children could be taken off the streets and taught a trade? What if disorderly people could be punished and corrected at the same time? This was a new way of thinking. It wasn't just about punishment or charity, it was about correction. The goal was to turn idle people into productive members of society, whether they wanted to be or not. A group of influential London citizens, led by the Bishop of London, Nicholas Ridley, saw an opportunity. They had a massive social problem on their hands, and there, sitting on the edge of the city, was a huge, empty, decaying royal palace, Bridewell. It was a building without a purpose, in a city that desperately needed a new kind of institution. So they went to the new king, Edward VI. He was Henry VIII's young son, a boy who was known for his piety and his interest in social reform. And Ridley and the others wrote a petition. They asked the king to grant the old Bridewell Palace to the city of London. They laid out their plan. The palace would be transformed. It would become a place to house, punish, and employ the city's idle poor. It would be a house of correction. They argued it would bring order to the streets, reform the sinful, and put the lazy to work for the good of the commonwealth. The young king agreed. In 1553, just before he died, Edward VI signed a royal charter. He gave Bridewell Palace to the City of London forever. The charter specified its new purpose. It was to be a place for the strumpet and idle person, for the rice and sturdy beggar, and for the poor boy and girl. The Palace of Kings was about to become a prison for the poor. The fall from grace was complete. The name Bridewell, once associated with royal splendor, was about to take on a much darker meaning. With the Royal Charter of 1553, Bridewell Palace officially became Bridewell Hospital. But the word hospital didn't mean then what it means today. It wasn't primarily a place for the sick. It was an institution, a place of shelter and control, and Bridewell was a new kind of institution. It was the first house of correction in England. It was a mix of a prison, a workhouse, and a reformatory. Its main purpose was to deal with London's undeserving poor through forced labor. The transformation from palace to prison began. The grand royal apartments were converted into dormitories and workrooms. The courtyards where ambassadors once walked became places for punishment. A whipping post was set up. So were stocks and a pillory. The gates of Bridewell, which once welcomed kings and emperors, now opened for a different kind of person. Who was sent to Bridewell? The categories were broad. Unemployed men who were considered vagrants. Women accused of prostitution or disorderly conduct. Petty thieves, runaway apprentices. Children who were homeless or considered unruly. It wasn't a prison for serious criminals. It was a place for social undesirables, for people who didn't fit into the neat order of society. The decision to send someone there was often made by a city official with little or no formal trial. An accusation was often enough. Once inside, life was grim. The central idea of Bridewell was correction through work. The inmates, as they were called, were forced to perform hard, repetitive labor. The work was meant to be punishing and, in theory, to teach them a trade and the habit of industry. These men were often put to work, beating hemp with heavy mallets. The tough fibers were used to make ropes for the Navy. It was back-breaking, dusty work. Others might be forced to turn a treadmill to grind corn. Women were usually given tasks like spinning thread, weaving cloth, or doing laundry. The goods they produced were sold to help fund the institution. The routine was rigid. Days started early and ended late. The food was basic and meager, just enough to keep the inmates working. The conditions were often crowded and unsanitary. Disease was common, but the defining feature of Bridewell was its system of discipline. Work was not optional. Anyone who refused to work or worked too slowly was punished. The most common punishment was a public whipping. This was a spectacle. Other inmates were forced to watch. Sometimes the public could pay a small fee to come in and see the whippings, which were seen as a form of moral entertainment. The idea was to break the will of the inmate and instill fear and obedience. For the women, there was a particular humiliation. Those accused of moral crimes might have their heads shaved. They were forced to wear a uniform and were subject to the authority of the matrons and governors. The goal wasn't just to punish their bodies with work and the whip, but to reform their character. It was a brutal and often ineffective method. Many people left Bridewell no more reformed than when they went in, only more broken. The Bridewell model was considered a great success by the authorities. It seemed to offer a solution to the problem of vagrancy that was better than simply whipping people in the street and sending them on their way. The idea spread quickly. Other towns and cities across England wanted their own houses of correction. They built them and called them Bridewells. The name of the old palace became a generic term for this type of institution. To be sent to the Bridewell meant you were going to a workhouse prison. So, the Grand Palace of Henry VIII was now a place of misery. The halls that once echoed with music and courtly gossip now echoed with the thud of hemp beating mallets and the cries of those being whipped. The transformation was total. Bridewell was no longer just a building. It was an idea. It was the physical expression of a new, harsher attitude towards poverty. It was a system designed to control and punish those on the margins of society. And this idea would shape the way society dealt with the poor for the next 300 years. The physical building of Bridewell had a long and troubled history after its conversion. The Great Fire of London in 1666 swept through the area and badly damaged the old palace structure. It was rebuilt, but as a more functional, purpose-built prison and hospital, losing much of its remaining Tudor grandeur. It was rebuilt again in the 18th century. For over 3 centuries, it continued its grim work as a house of correction, a prison for debtors, and a holding place for criminals. Its function evolved with the times, but its reputation as a place of punishment and hard labor remained. The world-famous diarist Samuel Pepys wrote about visiting Bridewell in the 17th century. He described seeing the sturdy rogues beating hemp and watching the imprudent women work. He seemed to view it as a necessary and even proper institution, a sign of a well-ordered city. His account shows how deeply the Bridewell idea had become accepted. By the 19th century, ideas about social reform were changing again. People began to question the effectiveness and the humanity of the workhouse and house of correction model. New types of prisons and social support systems were being developed. Bridewell, the institution, was becoming a relic of a harsher time. The old prison was finally closed in 1855. The buildings were demolished a few years later. Today, almost nothing of the original palace or the later prison remains. The site is now occupied by modern office buildings. A plaque on a wall is one of the few reminders of what once stood there, but the legacy of Bridewell is not in its bricks and mortar. Its legacy is the idea it created. Bridewell was the blueprint. It was the first institution to combine punishment with forced labor for the crime of being poor and idle. This model was copied across England and then across the British Empire. When English colonists went to America, they took the idea of the Bridewell with them. The first houses of correction in the American colonies were based on the London original. The workhouse system that dominated social policy in Britain and America for centuries is a direct descendant of Bridewell. The very name Bridewell entered the English language. For hundreds of years, it was a common noun for a local jail or a house of correction. You can find it used this way in novels by authors like Charles Dickens. This shows how powerful the institution's identity became. It was more famous as a prison than it ever was as a palace. Reflecting on the story of Bridewell is to reflect on a major shift in how society views its most vulnerable people. The medieval world, for all its own brutalities, generally saw poverty as a misfortune. Charity, often given through the church, was seen as a Christian duty. The poor were a part of the community to be pitied and helped. The creation of Bridewell marks a turning point. It represents the moment when poverty began to be seen not just as a misfortune, but as a moral failing. The sturdy beggar was not just unlucky, he was lazy, a sinner, a threat to the social fabric. The solution was no longer just charity, but discipline. The poor needed to be controlled, corrected, and forced to work. Bridewell was the machine built to do that. So when we ask what was medieval Bridewell, the answer is simple. It was a place name, it was a holy well, and a church. For a brief, glittering moment, it was also a Tudor palace. But the Bridewell that history remembers, the one whose name became a byword for punishment, was not medieval. It was a product of the modern world, born out of the social and religious turmoil of the 16th century. Its story is a dark and important one. It's the story of how a place of healing became a place of pain, and how a palace built for a king became a prison for his poorest subjects. The name is the only thing that connects the two worlds.